Shortly before 8 AM on the 7th of December 1941, the residents of the Hawaiian Island of Oahu were jolted awake by the sound of explosions and gunfire growing ever louder. Within minutes, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would descend on the US Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Armed with torpedoes, bombs and machine guns, they would devastate some of the most powerful vessels in the US Navy. In just 2 hours, it was all over, leaving the island's airfields and warships a flaming inferno at the cost of more than 2,400 American lives. In this video, using the latest technology, rare archive footage from US servicemen on the ground, and uniquely Japanese film capturing the events in real time, we'll explore the day that lived in infamy, minute by minute. This is the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor. By late 1940, with much of Europe at war, Imperial Japan's aggressive expansionist aims were under threat. The US had effectively begun to starve her of oil and other vital resources by embargo, limiting her ability to wage war. This left her with two choices. One, agree to US demands and leave occupied Manchuria and guarantee the safety of important island possessions in the Pacific, which she would never do, or two, invade the Dutch East Indies and British Pacific territories, thus securing vital supplies of oil and rubber. If she did so, retaliation from the Philippines and powerful US naval fleet based at Pearl could sever the vital supply lines required to sustain her island-hopping campaign. To guarantee a clear field in those amphibious attacks, Admiral Ishiroku Yamamoto planned a swift and crippling strike against the US fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, which would mean that for perhaps a year, Japan would be untouchable in the Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was actually relatively straightforward. Muster all of his aircraft carriers into one battle group, sail for Hawaii, and then launch a surprise aerial assault in 2 waves on the US battleship and carrier fleet stationed there, sinking or destroying them all in a single morning. But how simple would that task actually be? Pearl Harbor itself was based right here on the Hawaiian Island of Oahu, some 5,000 miles from mainland America's west coast. As an obvious target, it was on paper very heavily defended, being home to numerous military air bases with Wheeler Field, Kaneohe, Bellows Field, Hickam and Ewa the major ones servicing the island's 200 aircraft. In reality, only around 50 of those were any real use in defence. They were though protected by a new radar system, which could identify approaching enemy formations for the 31 anti-aircraft and coastal batteries dotted around the island. That's without considering the 100 plus naval vessels ranging from gunboats to battleships at Pearl itself. All told, more than 50,000 US military personnel were stationed on Oahu in late 1941. Despite the evident risks of an attack, with all the Pacific Fleet's naval eggs in one basket, the potential rewards for the Japanese were too high to ignore. And so, on the 26th of November, an enormous task force, the Kido Butai, left Hitukapu Bay, destination Hawaii. Let's take a closer look. The striking arm of that force would be all 6 of Japan's aircraft carriers, namely the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku and Jukaku. Totaling more than 420 aircraft, it was by far the largest aerial naval force in history to that point. Accompanying them were a mixed flotilla of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers and 8 fuel tankers, along with 23 submarines, 5 of which carried an additional 2-man dual torpedo-armed midget sub to be used in the attack. What about aircraft? There were 3 main types involved in the attack on Pearl. First was the Mitsubishi A6M2-0. A fast, manoeuvrable and powerfully armed fighter, it would be used to dominate the airspace over the target area. 79 would be launched in the attack. Amongst them was 21-year-old pilot Shigenori Nishikaichi, who would depart the carrier Hiryu with the second wave. The most numerous aircraft was this, the Nakajima B5N2 Kate, a single-engined 3-crew carrier-based bomber. All told, 143 would take part in the attack, with 40 of them armed with torpedoes. Just a quick point on torpedoes here. Pearl was very shallow for a harbour, with an average depth of just 12 metres. It posed a real problem for torpedoes, as they tended to descend below that depth upon initially hitting the water. In order to avoid that, wooden fins were added, which would break apart on impact but crucially keep the torpedo from descending too deep. The third main type of aircraft to be used was this, the Aichi D3A1 VAL dive bomber. Easily identified by its fixed undercarriage, the VAL was a highly manoeuvrable two-seater precision bomber armed with a single Type 99 250 kg bomb. 78 VALs would be launched against Pearl. Now we understand the plan, let's explore the harbour itself and the famous Battleship Row. Using mapping from the time, historical plans and aerial imagery, we can recreate Pearl as it looked that morning. In the centre lay Ford Island, home to a naval air station, some air defences and hangars. To the north-northwest was Pearl City, and directly south a large naval complex featuring a district headquarters, navy yard and hospital, naval intelligence headquarters and large oil and fuel storage facilities. Controversially, none of these would be targets in the coming attack. Also on the harbour's south side were several wharves and dry docks, in which that morning were numerous vessels, including the battleship USS Pennsylvania and destroyer USS Shaw. To the southeast side of Ford Island was Battleship Row. It was here that the main Japanese targets were located. Moored bow to stern, in two rows we see the Maryland, Oklahoma, Tennessee, West Virginia and Arizona. Alongside her was the repair ship USS Vestal, then the battleship Nevada alone to the northeast. On the western side of the main group, slightly apart from the others, was the battleship California and the fleet oiler USS Neosho. Whilst these battleships and supposedly present carriers Lexington, Saratoga and Enterprise were the prime targets for the Japanese, they were far from the only ones. Scattered around the west, north and east of Ford Island were cruisers, destroyers and auxiliary vessels, including just here, the USS Utah, a First World War battleship turned training vessel, on board which was 48-year-old Austrian-born chief water tender Peter Tomich. It was then on the morning of the 7th of December 1941 that the Japanese strike force found itself here as crews began their final briefing, with those historic moments caught on camera. All these actions, it should be remembered, were taking place between two nations nominally at peace. In fact, a controversial communique still discussed today, ambiguously declaring war on the US, may have been sent and received before the first wave launched. But regardless, none in Pearl Harbor knew anything about it that morning. At 5:50 AM, with cameras rolling, the first of 183 aircraft lifted into the air, with VALs, Kates and finally Zeros heading south towards their targets. The first sign that the day would be anything but ordinary for the Americans came at 6:37 AM when the percussion of explosions could be heard to the south of Pearl. Few knew it at the time, but the destroyer USS Ward had fired on and sunk a Japanese midget submarine trying to enter the harbour. They would be the first shots and casualties of the war in the Pacific. Exactly 25 minutes later, here at Opana Mobile Radar Station, Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott detected a huge formation of aircraft approaching Oahu. Contacting their commanding officer with the news, it was ultimately disregarded as an incoming flight of B-17 bombers due in from the States that morning. Tragically, the chance to alert those on the ground of the approaching danger was lost. 13 minutes later, at 7:15 AM, the first of 167 aircraft in the second wave of the attack began taking off and also heading south. By about 7:40 AM, the leading aircraft of Wave 1 were approaching their targets across the islands. With thick cloud cover over Pearl between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, it was hard to see the targets. But catching glimpses in the cloud breaks, Japanese Air Commander Mitsuo Fushida saw what he was looking for. Warships at anchor around Ford Island. Realising at the same moment that none of the vital aircraft carriers were present, all fire would be directed towards the battleships. About the same time, the very first strike was being made on the unsuspecting US airfields at Kanoe, Ford Island, Bellows, Iwa, Hickam and Wheeler. Those attacks, captured here on film by Japanese crewmen, when slowed down, show bombs falling on Catalina flying boats. Other aircraft, those posing far more threat, were also destroyed without ever having a chance to get airborne. The exact location identifiable by buildings in this image still present to this day. Such was the shock and surprise of those first attacks that over 180 aircraft would be destroyed on the ground, and only a handful of US pilots would get airborne to engage the enemy that morning. Within minutes, most of Oahu's aircraft were destroyed, with the attackers leaving burning airfields and many dead servicemen in their wake. Here at Pearl, the first aircraft were also beginning their attack. Approaching now below the clouds, 6 of the leading torpedo-carrying Kates under Lieutenant Tatsumi locked on to the seemingly high-value battleship Utah. Not realising she was now a training establishment, the first flight released their 6 torpedoes, slamming 2 directly into her hull. Those on board were thrown from their bunks as the 320kg explosive charges gouged huge holes in the hull, which immediately began flooding the lower decks. Chaos erupted as Utah began to list to port and men scrambled to reach the upper decks. Conspicuous was Chief Water Tender Peter Tomish, on duty in Utah's boiler room, who, realising the danger, immediately ordered his men to head for safety. Knowing that if left unattended the boilers would explode, he stayed. He's still there. Peter Tomish was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for the courage he showed that day. By 8:12, Utah, pictured here, had rolled onto her side as the survivors raced for the shore. 58 officers and men wouldn't make it, they being amongst the first casualties that morning. At about the same time Utah was hit, 8 AM, other Kates were making a wide turn to attack Battleship Row from the south. Levelling out at just 50 feet, each pilot picked one of the enormous targets to their front, and moments later 7 torpedoes had struck home, with California, Oklahoma and West Virginia each receiving multiple hits. On board West Virginia at that time was 22-year-old mess attendant 2nd class Dory Miller, who, having served breakfast in the mess hall, was collecting laundry when the first of several explosions rocked the ship. Racing topside to find his battle station destroyed, the powerfully built boxing champion began carrying his wounded shipmates from the fires which had broken out aboard. Amongst them was a mortally wounded Captain Mervyn Benyon, who was bleeding profusely from a shrapnel wound to the abdomen. Unwilling to leave his post, Benyon issued orders to defend the ship shortly before he died of his wounds. Having done what he could, Miller returned to the main deck to continue the fight. For many on board, the terrific explosions and flood of water that shook them awake were the very first they knew about the unfolding attack. As the first wave of Kates climbed and banked over their targets, one Japanese airman turned to his left with camera in hand and captured this powerful image. Here we see Nevada, Arizona, Vestal, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, Neosho, and California. Also visible were the ripples emanating from the hulls of Oklahoma and California, both of which have just been hit, with the white torpedo running tracks still visible in the sea. In the distance, Hickam Field can be seen burning after being attacked a few minutes earlier. With men on board each ship now scrambling for the main deck to man anti-aircraft guns, some found that ammunition wasn't available or that they were otherwise inoperable. All the while the attack continued. Oklahoma suffered at least 3 more torpedo strikes in quick succession as she began to roll to port, eventually settling on her side at 8:02, with 429 sailors and marines lost in the attack. With most of the 40 torpedoes released by now, the bomb-carrying Kates of the first wave continued the attack. In a few more minutes, 8 armour-piercing bombs had hit various ships around the harbour, and many men were strafed on deck or in the water as they struggled to escape the oil which engulfed the area. On board the Arizona, the call for general quarters had sounded at 7:55, and just under 5 minutes later, a flight of Kate level bombers passed over at a height of almost 10,000 feet, dropping 10 modified 16-inch armour-piercing shells on their target. 4 struck the Arizona's deck, causing major structural damage and starting fires on board. Disaster struck though, when at 8:06 a final shell penetrated the deck, likely striking the forward magazine beneath turret 2, resulting in an enormous explosion which threw debris hundreds of feet into the air and effectively tore the ship in two. Hundreds of men were killed outright, and in the minutes to come hundreds more would drown or succumb to their wounds as she settled on the harbour floor, with both the explosion and the resulting fires being caught on film. All told, 1,177 crewmen. More than 75% of the ship's complement and over half the total casualties that day would come aboard the Arizona. Amongst them were Rear Admiral Kidd and Captain Van Valkenburg, killed on the bridge when she exploded. Both would posthumously be awarded the Medal of Honor. For the next 15 minutes, the remaining aircraft of the first wave traversed the harbour, looking for further targets, strafing men in the sea and on shore as they did so. By now, US servicemen and civilians on the ground were well aware of the ongoing attack, and some even recorded the event, with these famous shots showing Japanese aircraft overflying Pearl at low level looking for targets. Finally, by about 8:15, the Americans were fighting back, with increasingly heavy flak driving some enemy aircraft away and shooting down others at extremely close range. Amongst them, on West Virginia, was Dory Miller. Despite not being trained in gunnery, he added the fire of his own .50 caliber Browning to that now filling the skies around Pearl. Eventually, with all his ammunition spent and ordered to abandon ship, he was one of the last men to leave the burning West Virginia as she settled on the harbour floor, bringing more wounded to safety as he did so. For the courage he showed that day, Miller was awarded the Navy Cross. Sadly, he wouldn't outlive the war, being amongst the 644 seamen lost in the sinking of USS Liscorn Bay. The first wave strike was over by 8:45, and there was a brief period of calm in the skies above Pearl, though devastation on the ground, with departing Japanese aircraft capturing this shaky film of the carnage left in their wake. The silence wouldn't last. 5 minutes later, at 8:50 a.m, radial engines were heard once again, this time from the east as the second wave struck the now blazing port. Again, Kates, Vals and Zeros descended on Battleship Row, but with no torpedoes in this wave, it was conventional bombs and strafing that would do the damage. With Battleship Row seemingly destroyed and ever heavier fire from Ford Island, many aircraft were driven south to attack targets closer to the naval base. Amongst them was the dry dock in which USS Shaw was undergoing repairs. Hit by 3 250-kilogram bombs from Val dive bombers, she immediately started to burn. 30 minutes later, the flames reached her forward magazine and she exploded in a huge fireball, it too being caught on film by multiple observers on the ground. At the same time that the Shaw was hit, the last remaining battleship, USS Nevada, was getting underway. In an attempt to escape the carnage, she was heading for the port exit, a move which drew the attention of 14 Vals in Wave 2. Led by aerial ace Captain Iguza, they would begin their assault at 9:50 a.m, attacking in groups of 3 Shotai, striking her with at least 5 250-kilogram bombs, one of which penetrated the deck and detonated near the gasoline tanks, starting multiple fires. In desperate hopes of preventing an explosion, the forward magazine was intentionally flooded, causing the Nevada to sink lower in the water. Now fearing sinking and blocking the port entrance, she was intentionally run aground here, close to Hospital Point, from where she burned for hours to come. In all, 90 sailors on board the Nevada were to lose their lives that day. By 10 a.m, it was all over. The last Japanese aircraft turned for home, leaving Pearl Harbor a burning wreck, with thousands killed and wounded in an attack which lasted a little over 2 hours. Back with the Japanese strike force, the bombers of the second wave eventually returned to their carriers and a possible third wave attack was ultimately cancelled. Jubilant with success, they dealt a severe blow to the US Pacific Fleet for a total loss of just 29 aircraft and 55 crewmen, along with 10 men aboard the 5 midget submarines. One of those aircraft to fail to return was that of Zero pilot Shigenori Nishikaichi, whose badly damaged aircraft had crash-landed on the Hawaiian Island of Niihau, where locals, who were unaware of the attack on Pearl, at first helped the downed pilot. Though when news spread, a fight ensued, during which Nishikaichi was killed in an event that became known as the Niihau incident. Back at Pearl over the coming days, men worked frantically to clear wreckage, put out fires and free those trapped on board various submerged vessels. Those moving events, caught on film, offer a powerful glimpse into what happened that December day. By the following morning, the scale of the tragedy was clear. In total, 18 vessels have been destroyed, sunk or run aground, with dozens more damaged. It was, though, the human cost that stole the headlines. 2,403 Americans have been killed, with more than 1,100 wounded, making the 7th of December 1941 the deadliest event ever recorded in Hawaii. That same afternoon, with Pearl Harbor still burning, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American people.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
He famously said, "The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost." Within days, the US was preparing for war, and though the path would be long and bloody, the attack on Pearl Harbor would eventually be avenged, and the US and her allies would emerge victorious from the Second World War. Today, what once happened at Pearl Harbor is commemorated in many locations across Oahu, with memorials to the fallen found throughout the island. Perhaps most powerful of all is this, the USS Arizona Memorial. Located directly over the sunken remains of the battleship, it marks the final resting place of the 1,102 servicemen lost on board that morning who remain on duty to this day. That brings us to the end of this video, which we hope you found interesting. If you enjoy our content, then please consider supporting us via Patreon or YouTube memberships. Each of these videos takes our team literally weeks to research, design, narrate and build, and your support in helping us to continue to create free content just like this is hugely appreciated. That's all this time. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.